plants are really a window into a culture. We are part of a large web, and if we are starting to pull at the threads of this web, we might be destroying something that's very intricate. These are complex problems. There's no easy fix. Science is also community. It's about exchanging information. It's also very much about talking to people, having this community.
Maybe the answer to our existential problem is already there in the nature. We just don't. We have the eyes, but we don't use it to really see.
Can we, as a species, leave some room for the wild?
Chaos, unpredictability.
Yeah.
Sobat Chronicles, hari ini kita kedatangan Norbert Peeters. Norbert Peeters is a botanical philosopher from Universiteit Leiden, and he also lectures at Wageningen University, and he is the author of his newly published book, Herba Ajaib Rumphius. Welcome to Chronicles, Norbert.
Thank you.
If I may. And, well, I'm so interested in some of your works, and it's fascinating to have you here. You come across a very interdisciplinarian scholar. And you've done degree in archaeology as well as in philosophy. And there's this new notion that I come across from reading your work, botanical philosophy.
Yeah.
So can you explain, first of all, your formation and how you come across interested in this field of botanical philosophy and what botanical philosophy actually means? Because, if you parse those two words together, people roughly know what botany and what philosophy means, but combined, no idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's unusual because usually philosophy is about humans, right? It's about ethics, how to act in the world, or what can we know, right? Epistemology, philosophy of science. In last decades, we see more also of animal philosophy, becoming interested in animal communication, animal ethics. Botanical philosophy is new in that sense because it's an unusual combination indeed, because plants and philosophy, I mean, if you look at the history of philosophy and you look at the different big names in philosophy, Aristotle, Nietzsche, they write a lot about plants also.
Did they?
Yeah, which I found curious to find out myself. So I got into botanical philosophy at the end of my study in philosophy. So I studied the philosophy of biology, but I was always really interested in animal behavior, animal aesthetics. And it was not until the end of my study that I really got into plants. My professor was designing a garden in the north of the Netherlands, and he was asking my help. And in archaeology, you also know a little bit about measurements. He wanted to make a map of his garden with all special trees. And we got to talking about plants and philosophy, and we found out, like, this is so strange. There's hardly any recent books on this. So we decided to write a book on it. And botanical philosophy is really about, so if you take botany or plant science, this consists of specialists, right? You can do taxonomy, you can do anatomy of plants, you can do ecology of plants. And then you really discuss the plant as a subject. You do experiments, you make hypotheses, you do tests, observations. Botanical philosophy, it's more about the relationship between humans and plants. I mean, and especially about like how this relation has changed throughout the ages. Like what a plant is to our eyes is very different from a Greek, in the time of Aristotle, or somebody from the Renaissance, or somebody from beginning of Enlightenment. We see that the meaning of plants changes through time. Like for instance, what a flower is, it's very different. If you ask a medieval person, what is a flower? You would say, European Christian medieval times, he would say, this is a gift from God to show to humans the beauty of creation. But the flower itself would be useless. If you ask modern science, it's like, no, usually flowers are there to attract pollinators, insect pollinators or birds or bats, and they use colorations, they use perfumes, and actually a plant is a sexual organism, and there is sexual intercourse in that sense, or cross-pollination takes place. So how we look at a flower is very different from how they used to look at a flower, and this is where this piques my interest as a botanical philosopher, like what meaning we give to to plants, but also what values we put on plants, right?
Right, yes. I mean, usually people would see the value or intrinsic values rather of plants or flowers as to what they mean to us as human, right?
Yeah.
We call it anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
So you are valuable as much as you are useful to me.
And this is how botany starts. It starts anthropocentric. So the first books on botany, it's about medicinal plants, how plants can help us cure diseases. And it's really not until 18th, 19th century in Europe that we start to appreciate plants for what they are and start to get more intricate knowledge of their biology, their ecology. It takes a long time. I mean, botany started as a subject that was part of pharmacy, right? Medicine.
Yeah.
Medicinal students would learn about medicinal plants. This was the only botanical knowledge there was. Of course, this gets more and more, and people become more interested. They also start to collect exotic plants, so they get a little bit of knowledge that way. But you really see in the growth of botany, you see this little bit of a separation between this anthropocentric view and more of a plant perspective.
So would you say that the utilitarian angle of your study, this botanical philosophy, contends with how one would derive new ethics from looking at the relationship between human and plants?
That's a good question.
And so as to offer a new way of looking at how our ethics derive, so
I think in a certain sense. So still, this is very young. So I work at Wageningen University, and students get a lot of classes on animal ethics. Because if you want to do some experimentation with animals, you need to have really good reasons. You need to talk to a committee, and you really need to pressure point, like, I want to experiment with animals for very good reason, because we really don't like it. So in that sense, there's definitely some animal ethics. I mean, there's also still bioindustry, keeping animals in very poor conditions, but there is animal ethics in that sense, I think.
Yes.
Plant ethics, not so much. If you talk to plant scientists, they experiment with plants, that's fine. That's not a problem. But does that then mean that plants have no ethical consideration? And there it gets interesting, because in a certain sense, I think the growth of conservation, ecological conservation, comes from the protecting of mainly forests. So when you see in America, you see John Muir, you see the Sierra Club coming about. This was really also about protecting old forests. And the same is true for the Netherlands as well. With the first nature conservation organization we have was sort of built on the fact that we've lost so many of our forests.
Yes, in the 1900s or something. It strikes me, a lot of people who talk about our relationship with nature, so this anthropological study of nature versus culture, or the relationship between the two, come from the Netherlands, curiously. I think probably because of their curious relationship with nature. I think you're probably familiar with the saying that God created the world, but the Netherlands is created by the Dutch.
Yes.
Because you got to deal with the fact that most of Netherlands is more than 2 meters below the sea level. So you got to artificially engineer your own existence.
Although I always like to add to that, yes, that's true. I mean, it's sort of like nobody really knows who said it first, but yes, this is a popular saying. Indeed, right? God created the world. The Netherlands was created by the Dutch. Although peat moss is actually also essential in creating the Netherlands. Like a lot of our peat, peat moss has this really great land building ability, right? So through peat, you get a rise of the land, and much of our land was peat. I mean, much of it was also dug out and used again as fuel, but in a certain sense, it was also built by plants.
That is fascinating. So, well, I do research on peat dynamics.
Okay.
Well, if you're interested, so Indonesia is, of course, land of home to tropical peat lands, right? And then some of the most difficult thing to predict the dynamics of peat is because of the multiple variables that play into the dynamics of peat. So you've got hydrology as a dominant variable that contributes to the breathing of peat, because it expands and as well as it shrinks. And then there's ecological contribution to the rate at which plants grow or decompose. And there's also mechanical burdens. You build a lot of structures on top of peat, but that also contributes to the integrity of the peat itself.
This is a big problem in the Netherlands, right?
So you
take the Vondelpark in Amsterdam, which is one of our first city parks. This was built on peat soil. So a lot of trees fall over because it's a really fine balance between a saturated soil with water.
Yes.
And like you said, the clinging in. So it's you have to sort of, it's slowly descending.
Yes.
And then the roots of trees can go in deep. So if there's strong gales, you will see trees falling over in the Vondelpark. And nowadays, if they're planted, they're put on poles.
Yeah.
And this is true. I mean, the entire Amsterdam is like, people call it the Venice of the North, or the dirty Venice of the North, because it's built on poles. The inner city, it's all built on huge trunks of trees from Scandinavia.
Oh, wow.
So it sits on a peat soil. Yeah.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I could imagine how you're interested in plants because of all of those factors. And I would like to say some of the things that you said in the past, and I quote, this is in regard to plant blindness.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned, and I quote, I used to pass a big Lebanon cedar at the Hortus Botanicus on my way to archaeology lectures, which you mentioned before. An imposing tree to see, but I didn't notice it. Strange, because you wouldn't fail to see an eye-catching building or a large animal. This inability is known as plant blindness. We just don't notice greenery.
Yeah.
So that's a curious phrase, plant blindness.
Yeah, and it came to me through the old director of Plantentuin Meijs in Belgium. He used this word, and he was referring to, the word was coined by two American botanists that were in university. They were noticing a decline in students that are interested in plants. Mm-hmm. But they were also noticing, like, plant journals are not as highly, valued?
Regarded,
regarded as maybe animal, right? But also nature documentaries. Usually this is animal soaps. Mm-hmm. And plants really play a role in the background.
Yes.
And I think in our lives, they usually play a role in the background. I mean, we like them and we see them. So in that sense, we're not completely blind. And this is also what these people that coined it, James van der Zee and Elizabeth Schuster, said. Mm-hmm. It's not that we don't notice it, but it's not that we don't see it, but we don't notice it. It's like we don't put our attention there. We don't usually understand how important plants are to our lives, to our survival, to the survival of many species around us. And we don't value them as much. So this is where botanical philosophy comes in. I think most people think of plants as simple, passive life forms, barely alive. I mean, they're growing, they're flowering, they wilt, but it's like almost not alive. And I think this is really like a core problem in a certain sense. So I really like this term plant blindness because it addresses that we have blind spots in the way we interact with the world. We pay much more attention to humans, like you said, architecture, animals. And it's also in some sense also because we don't necessarily, it took us a very long time to appreciate the complexity of plants.
I mean, yet it undergirds the whole structure of biotic systems, right? I mean, you get rid of the plants, the whole pyramid falls down.
Yes. Yeah,
that's a curious thing. I think
because we were talking a little bit, like you said, about this word Anthropocene. Like currently,
that's right. Yes,
we live in an Anthropocene, right? We live in a geological period that is almost like has a stamp of human human influence. Not necessarily in a positive sense, but I always like to say we also live in a Phytocene because our survival is dependent on plants, not so much the other way around, right? So it's very much the plants that dictate how we can survive. Yeah.
Which brought me to some of your past experiences where you taught at The Hague, right? You taught subject that has something to do with wilderness.
Philosophy. In Leiden this was in Leiden, I think.
It was in Leiden. Apologies. Okay. That's a new term that I just discovered last night, wilderness philosophy. And it also has direct relationship with the fact that we are, to a large degree, speculate on the existence of Anthropocene. But without putting too much of my words into it, so can you explain a little bit what wilderness philosophy is and why it's crucial?
Ooh, that's let me see how to answer that. So I think our idea of wilderness and the wild, the most dominant idea is that wilderness is like in a dualistic relation. Wilderness is here, human dominance is here. Like the city is here, the place where we are most dominant, and the wilderness is the place where we are least dominant, where there's hardly any human presence.
Yes.
We usually think of, as a pristine, pure wilderness. And I think this idea has cultural roots, but it's a myth. A myth that we project on nature. Because I don't think we should view wilderness as something that is devoid of humans, because if we do so, where is wilderness on Earth, right? Especially nowadays, living in the Anthropocene, we would have no wilderness. Maybe even Antarctica, right?
Yeah.
Pollution, atmosphere. I mean, we also influence it. So if you take as a definition, wilderness is the place where humans are not there,
have
no influence, then there is no wilderness. So I find this is a notion that came about, I think, most strongly in the Romantic period, 18th, 19th century, especially in America, like the first wilderness movements with thinkers like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Aldo Leopold, also part of this. And in wilderness philosophy, I really try to teach my students, like, should we maybe reconsider the meaning of wilderness? Not to say wilderness is the opposite of human control, but to think of wilderness more as that which pushes against our control, but against the control of all organisms. Because I think all organisms, in a sense, deal with wilderness.
Yeah.
They deal with what they cannot calculate, like what they cannot predict. And all animals, all plants are busy with trying to stay alive, trying to fight this force.
Yeah, let me break it down a little bit for the audience who's probably wondering why we're discussing wilderness philosophy and what Anthropocene is, because I think I haven't done the homework of explaining a little bit. So the Anthropocene is like a geological period where humans started to influence the geological processes, and it's very difficult to measure the extent at which human influences is spread across the globe, and much more difficult to find where it started in the beginning, right? Because when did humans start to have global scale influences? And wilderness philosophy, as you explain it, also has something to do with how the wild wilderness, it comes from the word wildeor, which means wild animal, wild beasts, right?
Yeah.
And then so this untouched, pristine ecosystem, and whether or not it has its own intrinsic value, whether or not it has its own ethics, and should we respect them? And it's become more and more relevant now because we're living and we're sharing a planet, and the planet is facing this existential crisis, namely climate change, which we all share. So like it or not, we have to think of not just of our own existence, which is completely dependent upon all of this wilderness and all the systems that we share together. And then so that's why it's really important, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And it starts with, like, this is also strange in a sense that if you ask somebody from 17th century about wilderness, they usually have negative connotations of wilderness. Wilderness is a place you do not want to go to. You want to avoid. You don't go into a dark forest. You don't climb a mountain. You don't go see a waterfall. You don't go to a stormy coast. Now, and this is so strange that, again, our values shifts. So in the Romantic period, we see a shift, and then all of a sudden, waterfalls, storm-beaten coasts, forests are becoming more and more aesthetically pleasing, but also more and more respected in a sense. So there's also this change in value. Yeah,
it strikes me as well as because there's this scholar from the Netherlands, your compatriot, by the name of Frances Gouda. Probably you've heard of her. She studies the colonization epoch and then the relationship between the Dutch colonizer and the Indonesian native back in the 18th century or even beyond that. So, I mean, she explained how the Dutch civil servant were to justify their existence in Indonesia at the time. And then they often send pictures back in the Netherlands. And then they would depict the pictures where a Dutch civil servant would be next to an Indonesian royal. This would be the Sultan of the Solo. Sultanate and probably the Yogyakarta, and they would depict it as a perfect harmonious marriage between the two. And the Indonesian royal, they are depicted as feminine, probably because they have shorter stature and smaller in size, and they are heavily bejeweled. And the idea, I think, or the message that they were trying to send back home is, we are out there to civilize the wild, the wilderness.
Yeah.
And you were right in saying that there seems to be a shift now where human is no longer a civilization or civilizing force, but like a cancer.
Yeah, this is the influence of the Romantic period, I think.
Right.
Where like philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you see this even in the appreciation, for instance, in the Netherlands, of the wolf.
Okay.
So if you talk to somebody again from the 18th century, they like dogs because dogs are civilized wolves, wild
Okay,
animals. Right. So nowadays we like usually wild animals. You know, you have beautiful nature documentaries where you see all these wild animals. Well, in the past it was actually the civilized animals. Those are the most important. Our cattle are domesticated animals, and not so much a wolf was seen as stupid, greedy. You know, if it's in tales, right? Yeah. So animal fables. Usually they're greedy, bloodthirsty, etc., etc. Yeah. Nowadays, wolf is really like the epitome of the wilderness, like really appreciated, protected, and people. It's still a discussion in the Netherlands because not all people like that. We now have wolves, especially the farmers. But yeah, you see the same shift, which is
that's really fascinating. Yeah, I never thought about that. Yeah, we do seems to grow a liking towards wild animals right now.
Yeah, it's even in Indonesian. So of course, I'm not super fluent in Indonesian history, but I think it's even like you had this. I think it's Rampok. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Like the fight with
Rempok is like a play.
Yeah, it's a bull and a tiger or it's like animals that fight each other in a certain sense.
Yes, we do that with roosters, or many different animals.
Yeah. But it's also with like also wild animals, right? I think are involved in a certain sense. Or
that's right. Yeah.
And I think maybe even you see a little bit of the romantic interest there, that the Dutch were fascinated by this wild animal fighting. But I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure on that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of interest in biology, and much of it is done in Indonesia. So you mentioned about, you haven't, but Darwin, obviously, in his work on evolutionary biology, is together with Russell Wallace, right, who've done most of his work around Ternate Island, laid the foundation of evolutionary theory by natural selection.
Yeah.
And then so people seem to not only know about new plants or new species, but also there seems to be a renaissance in terms of new way of thinking. I think before that, people see the world in terms of deterministic, really Newtonian way of thinking, where everything can be explained in terms of partial differential equations.
Causality, cause and effect. Yeah,
cause and effects. And then, how do people understand about pressure and temperature? Well, this hardcore thermodynamics, you can measure it and everything seems to be so certain. But then along comes Darwin, and people somehow, I think, underappreciate the actual contribution of Darwin to the conception of modern science. It's not just because you now know about where human beings possibly come from, but also the notion of what's true and what's not true, which is no longer deterministic.
But it has survival value.
It has a survival value. So it says that, what's true? What's true is what's good enough to perpetuate your kin or your gene, all right? And then so I think it makes a great shift. But what do you make of that? Because you studied Darwin extensively as well.
And always Alfred Russel Wallace as well. I find his story fascinating. So there's such a serendipity sometimes in science, right?
Yes.
Darwin, both of them read Malthus.
The Malthusians. Okay.
Essay on Population.
Yes.
They both read this. And this is really what sparks their idea.
Yeah.
And for Alfred Russel Wallace, it's strange because he has a fever. He's really sick. And then in a feverish dream, he remembers reading when he was working in the library. I forget where, but he was working in a library when he was younger in England.
Yeah.
And he remembers reading Malthus. And all of a sudden, like, it comes to him. And this idea that species are not fixed, that there's new varieties that arise, that there is this natural selection, there is this struggle for existence. And he sends his paper to Darwin. Like, you probably know this, right? He sends his paper to Darwin because he's uncertain if he can publish it. And Darwin is reading it, and it's like, it's a perfect summary of what Darwin has been working on for 15 years.
Yeah.
To put into words.
They're both quite courteous enough to each other, right? That they acknowledge
very much so.
Works, right?
I mean, Alfred Russel Wallace was always super pleased with the fact that he was acknowledged in this. And there was the Darwin-Wallace theory of natural selection, or descent by modification through natural selection. Yeah. Later on, evolutionary theory, or evolutionary theory. But of course, he noticed this where Darwin had the Galapagos, Wallace had Indonesia. And here you could see it. He could see the varieties on the different islands. He could see closely related species being very close to each other. Yeah. He could see more distantly related species being further apart from each other. Mm-hmm. He was starting to think of a shift in, he was also reading geology. He was reading Charles Lyell. He was reading about how the Earth's surface is changing, how temperatures are changing, how the climate can change. Mm-hmm. And this was really putting all these pieces of the puzzle together, like reading Malthus, reading about the fact that animals, just like humans, reproduce uncontrollably unless they're checked by their environment. And then when they're checked, you get this struggle for existence. And Malthus writes this about humans, but Darwin and Wallace say, well, this is not just humans, it's animals, it's plants, and plants especially.
Yes.
I mean, think of just one plant, how many offspring it has. Like, count the seeds on a plant. That's a lot. Right? If you plant all those seeds and you plant the seeds from that, within a couple generations, you can fill the entire Earth's surface. So there must be a really strict natural selection. And in that sense, to come back to your question, I think in a large part, this has changed. Like, there's this great quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky: "Nothing makes sense. Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution." Yes. And I think you can almost say, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution, which is interesting that evolution is also a light. It's a sort of climate of thinking. Like, after Darwin, we look at economics as an evolutionary process. We look at our iPhone or mobile phones. You can have a phylogenetic tree of phones.
Yeah, even planetary movement also.
Okay, I don't know a lot about that, but I mean, it's deeply influential for the way we think about the world. Yeah. And the great thing is that not just evolution, ecology as well. Now, they didn't have the word ecology, but both Darwin and Wallace, I think one of the other great contributions is that, so Darwin and Wallace notice plants and animals are related, share common ancestors, right? There's a phylogenetic tree of life, like a genealogical tree. Mm-hmm. But he also noticed is that species from very opposite branches in this tree of life deeply influence each other's life in such a complex way, such an intricate web, that it's really difficult to study. And I think we're still coming to grasp with how complicated that web is.
You see, this nuances in the way of thinking that Darwin brought into the modern science is very profound. Actually, I don't think people really understand this. My formation is largely mathematics, numerical mathematics, and you solve partial differential equations. You try to look at the system like flowing fluids, and then you try to predict what the velocity and the pressure. Well, you get the governing equation. You solve that with numerical methods with a computer, and then you get a number, a good, nice number, sometimes colorful too. So it's beautiful. But then I come across systems as complicated as reactive transport in porous media, right? And then you've got all the variables that is impossible to put all of them in the partial differential equations. And then you got to resort to statistical methods. You got to resort to stochastic methods. And then physics itself, in its development, comes across the works of Boltzmann Ludwig Boltzmann, and who introduced statistical physics, which really challenges the way traditional thermodynamics used to think about the world. And Darwin.
So what's really interesting is that Boltzmann calls the 19th century the century of Darwin. So I know very little about physics, but I think there's a good link between thermodynamics and evolutionary theory.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think that's what you were getting at. Yeah.
And also one of Darwin's sons is a mathematician, and one of Darwin's grandson is actually a statistical physicist by the same name, Darwin.
Oh yeah. I did not know.
I was trying to find last night. I was trying to find the link between maybe Boltzmann was influenced by Darwin, so you think so as well?
Yeah, well, in one of his readings, he says this. I know very little about thermodynamics. I did a little bit during my study in philosophy. We read a little bit about it because I think it's deeply influential for philosophy, but it's just too difficult for me. I don't know mathematics, and if you don't know mathematics, you're lost in thermodynamics, right? So, but I know a little bit of the cultural history of it. That there's a strong connection there.
There is
because it's about population dynamics, more or less. Right?
Yeah.
And now Darwin doesn't necessarily think in these terms. He's, for all intents purposes, he's a Newtonian.
He thought he is probably.
Yeah. Which is for his day very common to be. But yeah, there is a link there. There is a link, but it's a very tricky link. It's also something that's very difficult to. Yeah.
In German we say das ist ein zu großes Welt. It's a really big world.
Yeah.
Okay. No, and the second segment of our discussion, I'm going to focus on your book.
Yeah.
The new book. For those who are listening here, the book is in both Dutch and Indonesian language. So Herbe Ajaib Rumphius, and then. Well, first of all, what drew you to study Rumphius and write this book? And I know that you started writing this in 2016, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And it just got published this year.
The Dutch book is in 2019.
Okay.
And the Indonesian version was published.
Okay.
So the Indonesian translation.
All right.
I came across Rumphius. So this takes us somewhere completely different.
Yeah.
So I was working at Leiden University, and I love spending time at the library there. It has a beautiful university library with beautiful special collections. But I did not know about one thing in the special collection. So there was a new segment of the library being built, the Asian library, especially for all the documents we have on all the different books, all the different documents we have from Asia. And for this new segment of the library, there was this book that was edited by Alexander Reewijk, who is a good friend of mine. So he asked me to contribute to this book. It's called Voyage of Discovery, about like the special collections of the Asian library. And he said to me, you need to check out this really beautiful handwritten manuscript from 17th century on botany. You will love it. So I requested all parts, not knowing like how huge it was. So there was this trolley being rolled in the special collections, and it was like box. And she's like, you requested the original handwritten manuscript of Rumphius, the Ambonese Kruidboek or Ambonese Herbal. I said, yeah.
So it wasn't even a copy; it's an actual original handwritten manuscript.
Yeah, hand painted, with a very strange history because some of it was copied and the original was lost. Some of it is original, but beautiful. And just the first part. 11 kilograms, like a huge box.
Huh.
So just put like, do you want to look at one part at the time? It's like, yeah, please, so put it on the desk. And I just started reading through it. And it's amazing in that sense that if you would have to imagine in the 17th century, we have a few sources on botany from Indonesia. There is a couple of Portuguese naturalists, Garcia de Horta, Cristobal Acosta, with anthropocentric books.
Yes.
So medicinal plants from Indonesia. Basically, if you're sick and you're in Indonesia, these are the plants you need to take.
Yeah.
Of course, also some curious things, exotic things, some crazy information. But he had really almost nothing to draw on in his time. So there was a couple of Portuguese sources. There was a Dutch source by Jacob Bonsius, Medicorum Indorum, also about medicinal plants. And then you have the Ambonese Herbal, which is a strange name because it relates to the island of Ambon in the Moluccas.
Yes.
But it's really about the Moluccas, and even about Indonesia in a certain sense.
Yeah.
and it's so extensive. It's like 1,700 species. It's 800 different plates. So different depictions of plants, all hand painted there, based on collected specimens. We even still have some of the specimens collected by Rumphius, also in Leiden. So I fell in love with this book, and I started writing on it.
Just on that, for example, because I was born in Indonesia, I grew up in Indonesia. When you see something like that, do you see any parallel of that level of sophistication in biodiversity elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, or is it just one across among many? When you say things like, well, there's this hundreds of species, something like that, do you see that level of biodiversity in your study in other places, in Europe? Or
I think the strange thing is that even though it contains, I mean, this is difficult to predict because he's before Linnaeus, so we don't really have a strict species concept.
Yes.
But if you give a good calculation, it's 1,700 species, which is really, for Indonesia, it's nothing. I mean, there's thousands of species. So, but he laid the ground. You have to start somewhere. So, for instance, he discusses 36 orchids. Now, there's thousands of species of orchids in Indonesia.
yes.
But these were the first descriptions of orchids because these were not necessarily plants that were used, not necessarily anthropocentric in that sense. Interesting. Yes. But yeah, you have to start somewhere. And if there's a comparison, I think he really modeled his book a little bit on the herbal of Rembert Dodoens, who was a Leiden professor from Belgium originally. And that is also quite extensive. But you would have to imagine that Europe doesn't have that level of plant diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we have many plants in the Netherlands as well, but
mostly tulips, I guess.
And tulips, which are not even from the Netherlands, right?
Oh, what?
Yeah, they come from Central Asia,
being
brought to Persia, first cultivated in Persia, then to the Ottoman Empire. They were cultivated in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire brought them to Vienna. There, they were first grown in gardens of the Viennese.
Mm-hmm.
Then, a Viennese botanist, Carolus Clusius, who went to Leiden, was one of the first ones to introduce him to the Netherlands.
I see.
So this is 16th century. So, and it was even known as an exotic species, right? So,
yeah.
But of course, the tulip grew very big in the Netherlands. But wild flora in the Netherlands, a couple thousand species, but nothing compared to like a single island in Indonesia has more species than that, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, you see, most of I'm sorry to say or to generalize even that I think Indonesians don't yet realize the works of the likes of Georg Everhard Rumphius or Russell Wallace and the significance of their work done in this country to the conception of modern sciences. So could you explain a little bit who Rumphius was?
Yeah.
And I realized that he came to Indonesia in the years of 1650s,
yeah,
right, and then stayed there until the beginning of the 18th century. And then what kind of work that he did and how that shapes the Western understanding of the local culture through Rumphius' works or lens.
Yeah. So he has quite a tragic story. He has a very tragic story for a naturalist, especially.
Yeah.
So he there's little information about his life. He wrote a poem about his life, about the beginning years. So he says he studies at the gymnasium in Hanau, in Germany.
Yeah.
He's born in Wolfersheim, 1627, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
He studies at the gymnasium. His father teaches him mathematics, which is very important because it will become important when he goes to Indonesia. And then when he says, when he graduates, he says, he's 18 years old. I want to leave the house, my parents' house, out of the love of science.
Just for a moment, for those who don't know, gymnasium means if you graduate from a gymnasium, you get a master level degree, right now.
Gymnasium is like the highest level of high school.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like you learn Latin, Greek.
Okay.
You have a standard program of like language, arts, especially in his day, language, arts, theology, different pieces, and Latin and Greek.
Right. So this is a fresh-faced 18-year-old curious guy.
Yeah. He wants to travel the world out of love of science. And here you really see the influence of the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Like Francis Bacon saying, go out into the world, go beyond what we know, go find new knowledge. And he takes this really at heart, like he wants to do this. So he's 18 and he signs up for an army to go to Venice, he thinks, but he's secretly recruited for a war. So he gets put on ships to the Netherlands, gets put on a ship to go to Brazil to fight the Portuguese. And he describes this voyage, really terrible voyage. Like already when they're cooked up in this ship for a long time before they can sail, because they have to have favorable winds. Yes. So they're cooked up in this boat. They sail off. Immediately there's disease on board. He says multiple of his companions die, get thrown out into the ocean, and he sees wild sea creatures eating them. Then he reaches Gulf of Biscay, basically Atlantic Ocean, like near Portugal. Their ship gets captured. He's a prisoner of war. He is forced to be in the Portuguese army. We know very little about this, but he gets released eventually. He travels back to his parents, goes again to the Netherlands, and now signs up to the Dutch East India Company. And now it's a little bit better for him. He sails to Indonesia as a soldier. He goes to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. Yes. He's recruited again into a war, the Great Ambonese War, which is at that time already like the governor of the Ambonese Quarter, they call it, because the Ambon is very important, because the first fortress the Dutch East India Company has is Fort Victoria in Ambon. Yeah. So he's again recruited into a new battle, basically. And the Great Ambonese War is about getting a monopoly on clove trade. Yes. So he fights in this war. He does not like fighting. So luckily he knows mathematics. So he can help design fortresses. So this is what he continues to do. And then he pleads to the governor of Ambon. Please, like, can I leave the army? Can I have a civil job? They make him merchant in the clove trade. Luckily, he's very good at languages. He learns Arabic. He learns Bahasa. He learns Chinese. He learns the different languages, which was very good of him to do. Yeah. So he becomes a spice merchant, basically, in Ambon. But this frees up his time finally. Finally, he can have some free time to study. And this is when he gets this big plan, like, I want to be the Plinius of the Indies. Meaning, like, Plinius the Elder, the Roman fleet commander, who was also a naturalist, who wrote this Naturalis Historia, like this big book on the natural history of Europe. And he wants to do the same for Indonesia. So he wants to write about the geology, geography, botany, zoology, and the people. He does not complete that work, but he comes very far. And his languages really help him. And this is where you get to your question, on how to combine it with local knowledge. I think you had naturalists of the Dutch East India Company, even though the Dutch East India Company was not fond of naturalists. They did not fund science. Yeah, it's a company. They want to make money. They don't care too much about nature. Yeah. But they did realize there were sometimes special people. But most of these naturalists had very little knowledge of their surroundings, had very little knowledge of language. Yeah. So they couldn't really communicate. So it was with short books, short descriptions. Rumphius is special in that he can communicate with almost everybody in society. And he has correspondence like throughout the Moluccas who give him information. Yeah. And he starts to gather, like a vacuum, he starts to gather all this knowledge. Medicinal knowledge he gathers from the dukuns, the female physicians in the Moluccas. He gathers knowledge from orang kayas, important people, but also from fishermen, from priests, from, how do you say, in Islamic tradition, how are they called? Forget the name. Well, different people that are located there. And
missionaries, or
I don't know, like who's the head of a mosque? I don't know. Like we have
ulama or something.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, just like important people, but also commoners, right? He talks to everybody.
So he didn't really distinguish science people and non-science people. So he just amalgamated all of those local wisdoms, let's say. The dukuns is a pejorative word these days. It's some people who are not within the boundary of science and then who laid their theories on something mystical.
He really respects them.
But he respects them, right?
He respects them highly. Okay. Talks highly, praises them highly. Yeah.
I see.
He's a fan of tropical medicine. Because he does not like, and this is a strange idea, of course, there was medicine being brought in from Europe.
Yeah.
But he says like, well, this is all withered away. This has been on boats for months.
I see.
This is poor quality. If you want to fix, if you have a disease here, ask the people what to take, because they know. So he respects that. And in that sense, he's sometimes very unfriendly to people, or unfriendly in his writings, right? Because he's also a Christian, European, thinks a lot of himself, So sometimes he's derogatory to people as well. He says like, well, this is an old wives' tale. This is probably nonsense.
Yeah.
And he checks stories, right? So if he hears a story, he asks multiple people to verify.
Corroborate, yeah.
So in that sense, he's a scientist. He makes his own observations.
Yeah.
He tries to observe. He tries to ask multiple people. But he does include a lot of knowledge. It's almost like an encyclopedia. But he includes stories. Even though if he doesn't believe in a story, he still includes it. And this is where it's so important that he also includes the things that he doesn't believe in. Because then you get a more complete picture. And it's, So, in that sense, that's why it's such it's a great source for us today.
And therefore knows a lot more about the local history and local wisdom at that time because of his work. And I guess you kind of get the new lens through which you understand the Ambonese and the Moluccas.
Yeah, and this is what I find very interesting. Of course, I know little about cultural history of the Moluccas, but through a herbal, you learn a lot about culture.
Yeah,
because plants are really a window into a culture.
Right.
If you want to know about rituals, you want to know about what people play with, what people eat, what people drink, construct their houses of. This is all plants. Plants are such an important part of culture, of life, of daily life, of religious life, symbolic, that you really, through plants, you get intimate knowledge of the culture. Yeah.
Well, on that, how relevant do you think is Rumphius's work today in understanding Indonesia or even Southeast Asian biodiversity and cultural heritage? Is there anything that we can learn in context of today's Southeast Asian narrative?
I think so, in the sense that, of course, you also have modern day science, and nowadays we know a lot more about these topics he's writing about. He, for instance, he does not know how orchids reproduce.
Yeah.
He does not know that plants are pollinated. He does not know many things that we nowadays find common knowledge. So in that sense, it's also outdated a bit. But I think it's so important because, well, first of all, you have to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's a very good reference. It's the first, in my opinion, it's the first attempt at a flora of Indonesia. And in that sense, it's also like you have to sort of respect where a tradition comes from. Of course, nowadays we have far more knowledge on the flora of Indonesia, but you have to start somewhere. And also it's a very good reference. Like many of species he talks about are nowadays endangered. Some species he talks about are no longer there. Probably, right? So I think you really get also a window into the past. Like, okay, how was Ambon like when he was alive?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. But also, like, some of the languages have disappeared that he includes in his herbal. Like, he will include names of plants from languages that have disappeared. Cultural stories about plants. So he talks about a kingdom in, I think, Sulawesi that have an origin story of that they find their king and queen in the bamboo forest. They go out into the bamboo forest and they find the huge giant bamboos. They cut them and all of a sudden they cut a bamboo and they hear like, ow! And they find in a bamboo, they find their king. And then the king says, you need to go out back into the bamboo forest and find my wife. They start to cut bamboo and they find his wife. Now it's a short note. It's only a couple sentences, but this is the origin story, the origin myth of a certain, of a group of people, right? Of a certain culture. That maybe is no longer here, but so in that sense, it's also very valuable in that, yeah.
I mean, well, I sometimes say in previous episodes that in today's world, geopolitical influence is very, very strong. It determines how people behave, how the world works, how people trade, and it's going to penetrate domestic policies in ways we've never seen before, because the world is getting more and more interconnected, and there is no, or seemingly no, binding morality. People seems to, in terms of country, operate based on their national interests. So in a place where there is no binding narrative or absolute values, you need to have a strong narrative, and people have this narrative. For example, the Europeans have that narrative, or at least the US, they see themselves as a bearer of democracy. And in lieu of that, I think Indonesia, my argument is lacking that convincing global narrative. And I think looking at Rumphius's work or Wallace's work, we can be seen, or we have the potential to be seen as a country where sciences could emerge, or new medicines, new food can emerge from. But it's not yet cultivated, and it's not convincing either, because it doesn't seem to stem from our understanding of our own identity and our own past. You mentioned about Rumphius's work and all of this local wisdom in languages that is now ceased to exist. Without clear understanding of our own identity, any narrative that we put forward to the world would be less convincing.
Yeah. You see, I think, and this is just it's a fact of history, but it's also a sad fact of history, is that there has been for a long time a one direction flow of knowledge from Indonesia to the Western world. Rumphius writes like I said, he has a tragic life. One of the things that happens to him is that he loses his eyesight. He becomes blind, and he finishes his work through help of the Dutch East India Company who send him. But he has to write in Dutch, because nobody knew Latin. He starts in Latin, but when he turns blind, there's nobody that knows Latin of the Dutch East India Company, so he gets no help. So he writes in Dutch, which was really helpful to me, because then I know a little bit of Latin, but my Dutch is better.
Know Dutch,
yeah. But the flow of information has been one way, and in that sense, I agree fully with you. The stories of Wallace, the stories of Rumphius should also return to their birthplace, their origin, their place of origin.
Yeah.
He wrote down stories of the people here. So I think that it's important that these stories get, how you say, return in that sense. Because, and of course, I'm not sure, because it's a very difficult topic to answer. But I think it's important that, and also to know that they fell in love with the flora and fauna of Indonesia. I myself, just arriving in Jakarta, seeing these plants that he describes in their grandiose, in this grandiose way. Yeah. I can see why they fell in love with nature here. And I think this love is important to share. It's important to share, why did so Rumphius, of course, he comes to Ambon completely based on the spice trade. So in a colonial system, his life there is made possible by the spice trade. But he stays, and at the end he calls Ambon his home. This is where the place I want to also die, because this is where I feel home. And I think that love that they have for nature, that Alfred Russel Wallace also has. I think that it's important to communicate. Even, well, the way I know that we haven't had a convincing narrative is because everywhere I see, among my other diaspora colleague in the UK, for example, they're typically, although they're in academic community, not proud of Indonesia as a place where great sciences used to be experimented upon. Right? They even find it difficult to find where exactly Russel Wallace did his work. We sort of know the area where his house was, but we don't really know or pinpoint where it was. And
I
think we haven't contributed to, because we suffer a little bit in the Western world of this hero narrative of science.
I see.
It's science heroes. Alfred Russel Wallace, Charles Darwin, and Rumphius to a certain extent.
Well, they were.
And they were exceptional figures, no doubt about it. But we forget they are nothing without local knowledge, correspondence. Like Alfred Russel Wallace as well. It's his help, Ali, who shows him the birds of paradise. He shows him the good spots, so he had to find them. when Beccari from Italy is looking for bowerbirds, he's not looking for bowerbirds. The Papuans tell him where the birds are.
Yeah.
So, and also Rumphius as well. He has helped
Yeah.
the entire time. He has servants that help him. He has the local knowledge that, I mean, yeah. So in a certain sense, I think it's also important to understand, like, yes, there are important figures in science, but science is also community. It's about exchanging information. So it's also very much about, talking to people, having this community. Rumphius might have turned blind, but he had eyes everywhere throughout the Moluccas who gave him information.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that is very important to understand.
Yeah,
right?
People don't realize that, yes, they were towering figures, but they couldn't have done what they've done without the help of Indonesian local wisdom. And this extends beyond biology or botany, actually. We mentioned a little bit about Anthropocene, and the Yogyakartan has been grappling with Anthropocene since, I think, the 18th century. What's societal at the time is also what's geological. For example, when the sultans were inaugurated, the first thing he did was to provide offerings to the seas, to the oceans, to the mountains, to the rivers. They see that their power derived from geological processes. Mm-hmm. And this is what the scientists in the West has been scratching their heads, right? Where is this porous boundary between society and geology actually starts to become relevant? So, and then in the world right now, because of the shift of how people see nature and culture, and the fact that we are having this similar existential problems in the world, in this planet that we share together, the way countries articulate their claims over their stewardship of the earth becomes more and more important. Mm-hmm. And we talked about Aldo Leopold before, so that's the narrative. Or how do you derive environmental ethics? Well, what's true is what constitutes progress in the integrity or beauty of the biotic systems.
And also what is good.
Or what is good, right? So we are good because we speak environmental ethics.
Yeah, I think, so Aldo Leopold, I mean, especially in his essay, Land Ethic, he says, like, we have always had a conqueror mentality when it came to nature.
We as in?
Human beings.
Okay.
Now, maybe he may be talking from a very Western perspective in that sense, but that's difficult too. I think, it's not, but also not to say that only Westerns are conquerors, but I mean, but he really wants to see a shift from a conqueror of nature to a member of a biotic community. So when he was a ranger for the Forest Service in the US, he had to shoot wolves. It was one of his jobs. He had to cull the wolf population because that would drive up the deer population, and then hunters could hunt deer. Mm. And then one time he shoots a she-wolf that has young wolves with her. Yes. And he has this like epiphany, he has this like philosophical moment, and he says, like, what would the mountain think of my actions? Which is thinking like a mountain. What would the mountain think? Mm-hmm. Which is a strange question to ask, of course. Like, think a mountain can think, what is this, right? Mm-hmm. But I think he means, if you try to take in a more holistic approach, what am I doing? I'm killing an apex predator who is part of an ecological web. The apex predator keeps down the deer population. This influences plant growth. This influences abiotic circumstances. Mm-hmm. We are part of a large web. And if we are starting to pull at the threads of these webs, we might be destroying something that's very intricate and very old, right? And I think that is, so he calls this land ethic. And then he says, like, what is good is what contributes to the stability, the beauty, the integrity of this biotic community. Yeah. Which is a very difficult notion to understand. Also, the words is strange, right? Beauty, stability. We also know that ecosystems are dynamic in a sense, right? So, but I think his main idea is a holistic approach. It's basically saying this: we need to make offerings in the sense that we need to realize that. And this is also something that Alexander von Humboldt also knows. Yeah. If you cut away the trees, it's not just you don't have any trees anymore for fuel. It's not just anthropocentrically bad, but you influence the weather. You influence erosion, right? If there's no more trees, Think of the mangrove forest that Rumphius describes.
Yeah.
Rumphius describes how these mangrove forests are building land and protect the islands. If you take all these mangrove forests, what do you're really influencing the local milieu, the local environment in a large way.
You could make also the same anthropocentric argument for that too. But eventually it will to your detriment as well. If you cut this tree, through some fortuitous effect, it's going to take a toll on you and your descendants as well. So, but I'm curious about these figures, like you mentioned about Thoreau as well, right?
Yeah.
Those people who seem to have the epiphany. I think probably because we are more and more living, clustering in the city areas, we see less and less of nature. We get less and less chance to get such epiphany. I mean, Thoreau spent 2 years or something in the wilderness,
sort of,
when he wrote this.
Not really wilderness, but
he had a hut,
self-built house on a piece of land of his friend, which was a production forest next to a railway. But nonetheless, he also thinks like, so for instance, he wants to provide, so he wants to live there self-sufficiently.
Yeah.
So he makes a bean field to grow beans for to stay alive. And then he says like, well, but if I'm also destroying something, I'm also destroying the plant community that is there by making this field. Right? So I think it's also really that understanding of your ecological impact of your own doing. Right? Not just, if you just think about yourself.
Yeah.
And you don't think about anything. You just, you make an agricultural field. You get profit. This is what you do. But if you think more ecologically, like, well, but I'm also taking away something.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at, I show my students as well, aerial photography of Borneo.
Yeah.
And if you go from the 50s to the 90s or something of last century, the deforestation on a scale that is unimaginable, right?
Yeah.
But the same is true for the Netherlands. In the 19th century, we had a forest cover of about, I think it's 4 or 5%.
Yeah.
It's now 14%, which is a little bit better. But I mean, Holland is called woodland. So that means it used to have all forests. Where are the forests? It's all gone. So we also, our own past is the same, right? So deforestation is really I cannot stress enough how big the impact of this is.
One cannot overstate how important this problem and how existential this problem is. My other challenge is to differentiate which one is true environmental or very true, authentic environmental concern driven activism, and which one is political right now. Because among scientists who works in mathematics or engineering, like myself, if you do research in climate change, you're likely to get funding. So there's this incentive for you to keep screaming climate change. So it becomes less and more difficult to differentiate which one is of true activism and which one is there and just to say words and to some degree base their actions on narcissism.
Yeah.
Just to some degree. And
I think, people would like to call it greenwashing, for instance. I see a lot of greenwashing. I see a lot of things that strike me as very odd. For instance, you get these things like, you buy something, we plant a tree for you. Have you ever seen this?
Yeah.
But we don't really know.
You just guilt-tripping people. Yeah.
What tree? Where?
Yeah.
Why? Also, is this good for the environment?
Yeah.
But people think of it as like, oh, I harmed the environment a little bit, but but they're planting a tree, so it's all good.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of greenwashing, and like you say, there's a lot of trendy words, sustainability, the climate change. If you tie onto that, then you get funding quicker. But it's also like, on the other side, we know, and I think we are just, or at least many people are coming to terms with the fact that we have a very large impact on this ecology.
No doubt, we have a great impact. Yeah, but it's
true. It's difficult to say,
right? Because you dilute the true essence of the danger by just spreading words easily, just using this word cheaply, this green net zero without actual contribution or commitment.
Thinking that there's a tech fix for everything. There's a technological fix for everything.
Yeah,
we can geoengineer. This is also something.
Everything. I mean, I attended this COP26, which happened to be in Glasgow, and then nowadays you're talking about 2 degrees, which is unlikely to happen. I think it's going to be closer to the 3 degrees scale. So you're not doing anything much, and most of this problem is also interdisciplinary in nature. Although it's really important, but funding bodies aren't really giving funding for supporting interdisciplinary works because it constitutes high risks. So, well, there are some authentic actors in play. For example, those who put their own resources. There's this kid called Boyan Slat or something. And well,
from Delft,
Yes, from the Netherlands.
But also that, I think, and of course, as a philosopher, I know. I don't know a lot about many of these topics because I haven't studied them thoroughly. But I always like to say to my students, these are complex problems. There's no easy fix. Like even Boyan Slat, it's a great idea, right? Gather plastic from the ocean. But then you get a marine biologist saying, in the top layer of the ocean, you get a lot of marine life. And are we not, by getting rid of the plastic, they've already said we've identified multiple species, right? So, I mean, that get taken up as well. Now, of course, you can then maybe improve upon the idea again, et cetera, but just to show, like, we would like so much for it to be an easy fix. But I think every time we are confronted with the fact that these are very complex problems that would take a lot of ingenuity, brain activity, coming together of communities, talking to many to even come close to a fix.
It's a complex problem, and I think, again, going back to our previous item of discussion, I think it has to come from authentic understanding of our own identity, as a country, because you need to have a binding narrative that guides your actions and attitude towards environment, and that cannot be faked. Indonesia does have its own narrative about where its own environmental ethic could derive from. For example, you mentioned about Sulawesi Island, which is a place where Bugis people come from. And the Bugisian have their own idea of how they were created. There is this 1.5 times longer literary work by the Bugisian people than Mahabharata that talks about how the people of Bugis were created at the time, which is the result of the marriage between the upper gods or the upper echelons god, and then the lower land dwelling goddess of the people under the sea or something like that. And then men were created to strike a balance between what's on the sky and what's under the sea. And then so they always have to see the nature as something to be taken care of. They have to keep the balance between what's useful and what preserves the environment. For example, but stories like that aren't anywhere to be found unless you go to the Netherlands, because that's where the Netherlands artists and cultural icons, they create this play based on La Galigo manuscript, which we don't realize ourselves.
I did not know also.
If you want to find good artifacts about La Galigo, you got to go to the Netherlands, which is a shame. I think your work could also bring about knowledge exchange from the Netherlands or even beyond, and collaborate with Indonesian scientists so as to make you mentioned about the traffic of information has always been one way. Well, this particular work, if it gets the funding and interest from the local scientists as well as communities, it can serve as a bridge for knowledge exchange.
And of course, I'm generalizing. Of course, there has probably also been a lot of exchange. Probably there has been 2 directions, but it has been favored in one direction for a very long time. So, of course, now my book is published. But the Ambonese herbal of Rumphius is not yet translated, to my knowledge, into Bahasa. And I think it's important that such key works about the history of the flora and fauna of Indonesia that they are available to people.
Yeah.
At least available. They're available in English, so they're available to academics, but they should also be available to the people. Like you said, a common narrative, and I like this idea of striking a balance. And I sometimes say to my students, I think it's a bit of a curse and a bit of a blessing that, so you know, also there's many species that are called ecosystem engineers, like beavers, termites, that influence their environment on a large scale. We are also an ecosystem engineer, but I think the difference is that we know, or we come to terms with the fact, or we're starting to come to terms with the fact that we are ecosystem engineers.
Yeah.
And that, of course, our influence is far larger than beavers, but you wouldn't say to a beaver, well, don't build the whole dam, make a hole in the dam to restore the flow of the river.
Yeah.
But we have the sense of, we also know about the impact. We know about our larger scale impact. And this is a slow learn. Like, take, for instance, plastic is only now becoming a widely known problem.
Yeah.
Like Bojan Slot is somebody, he's from our generation, right?
Yes.
So we slowly come to terms with the fact that how much of an impact we really have.
Yeah.
And now what to do. So this is, I think, the $1 million question, or right? In a sense that I don't have to answer, but I think it is interesting that we have that we can have this awareness.
People. I mean, you mentioned about these beavers as bioengineers and termites as well. So one of my works with those entomologists in France has been to investigate the reason why termites can make buildings, bioarchitectures that can thermoregulate itself. So there's this bunch of guys from MITs led by, I think, Professor Mahadevan, his name. So he brought thermometers, and then he went to African regions, and then he measured the chambers of the queen of termites colony, and then found out that despite diurnal temperature changes outside of the mounds, the temperature fluctuation inside the chamber is very, very stable. Well, because they need it so that the fungi that they harvested can process the woods so as to make it soft that they can eat. But the fungi needs a tropical forest like humidity and temperature. And then so we brought the samples and then put it on X-ray scanners and tried to reconstruct its 3G topology and runs fluid simulation there and try to investigate whether there's meaningful statistics that you can take from that sophisticated bioarchitectures and make synthetic bricks or new architecture from that. So when you talk about this bioengineering species, these aren't just sound bites. They really make sophisticated buildings and structures that we can really learn from. Which is fascinating.
Some leafcutter ants have been doing agriculture for millions of years, as compared to us. So I think, definitely there's something to learn there, and also we take inspiration from nature, right? So I think one of the most beautiful stories about inspiration from nature, there is a climbing cucumber here in Java called Alsomitra macrocarpa, which is a climbing plant that climbs all the way on top of the canopy and makes a really big fruit. And in that fruit are seeds that have wings, but not just like many seeds have wings, but usually it's always on one side. But this has wings on two sides. This was described by Friedrich Alborn, a German botanist.
Yes.
And it was taken up by Igo Ettrich, who was building airplanes in the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. Now, when Leonardo da Vinci tried to look at nature for flying, so Da Vinci made many flying machines.
Yes.
But most of them were based on animal flight, bird flight, right? So he saw swans coming in, and he was thinking like, okay, how can I imitate nature and also fly? But you don't imitate birds, you imitate seeds, you imitate plants. This was the big discovery for flying. Now, not just plants, but you need to have a stable wing.
Yeah.
So our planes have a stable wing. Now, a seed can, of course, if it has a stable wing, it can still rotate.
Yes.
For a seed, that doesn't matter if it rotates. For us, not so nice if we rotate through the sky. So you also need, the tail is usually, that's based on like, one of the flyers he makes is called, I think Der Taube, the pigeon. because of the wing, or because of the tail. The tail is like a pigeon, but the wing is like the seed of the also Mitra macrocarpa from Java. So I find this to be super interesting that we in that sense that we take inspiration from nature.
Maybe the answer to our existential problem is already there in the nature. We just don't. We have the eyes, but we don't use it to really see it.
Maybe. And then you come to the plant blindness again.
Because that's a good note to end. But before you end, we end this session. What's the next work that you have in mind? So, you mentioned about some other things that hasn't been translated yet. But where do you go from now?
So I'm finishing my dissertation, finally, after it's been long in the making. So that's the first on my agenda is finishing my dissertation. And that's about the origin of invasion ecology, our thinking about where plants, and especially plants, and invasive plants. So I'm really interested in how did this thinking come about native plants, exotic plants, the influence of invasive species. So, for instance, I found out that Darwin is one of the first ones to use the word invasion when it comes to plants and animals.
Okay, like weeds.
Yeah. He traveled through Argentina and he saw a Spanish plant growing wild there, a cardoon plant. And he said, this is invasive and it's destroying native plant and animal species. So he was one of the first ones. So also our whole thinking of invasive species comes a little bit from Darwinism. So this is so I'm really interested in, and another project I'm really keen to start on is a book on the cultural natural history of weeds.
On weeds? Okay, all right, okay.
I find that really interesting because weed is a strange word.
Yes, it's largely negative.
Largely negative, but it's also not an objective term. It's not a scientific term.
Okay.
Because, it's hard to be objective because there's no weeds without humans. If we're not here, we don't have weeds. So it's dependent on our negative value we place on plants. Now, sometimes there's a good reason to place negative value on plants. And also, I always find it interesting if I ask people who has never weeded before in their life, nobody raises their hand. Everybody's weeded. It's a common thing we share with. So I find this to be very interesting. Sometimes I call humans like the gardening ape. We are, if we are good at one thing, or we're good at many things, but if we're good at one thing, if you look at orangutan, you look at gorilla, chimpanzee, what do we excel in? Making gardens.
Yes.
We have many gardens, many types of gardens. And I think this is very interesting. And so I call weed a relational term, a relational concept. It's based on the relationship between humans and plants.
Yeah, this could open up a new series of discussion, but the fixation on humankind to make wilderness but control. Like a garden has been fascinating. So we've been making walled gardens since we remember.
People say wilderness as a concept only comes about when we start to make a garden, because then you section a part of land off of the wilderness.
Yes.
And then you dominate that.
But then you dominate it.
Yeah, but your domination has to be continuous. Like we know also, there's no end to weeding. You don't say like, oh, now we've done all the weeding.
They come again.
Yeah, they come again.
Yeah.
And there also you see a little bit of the wild that is in our garden, the wilderness that is in our gardens is weeds, I think. It is what goes against our control. So I view wilderness as a concept, as that which goes against our power, our control.
Yes, which plays into our affinity for conquest.
Yeah. And I think, so can we, as a species, leave some room for the wild, right?
Chaos, unpredictability.
Yeah. We have to, because, right? There's no total control. There's no totalitarian control. Every gardener knows this. Yeah. You cannot be a totalitarian gardener. Yeah. Because even if you try, life always finds a way, right? It's always like, And
it destroyed the joy itself if you completely have everything under control.
Yeah. But so I really like this concept of weeds, and I like the history, because of course also what is now today a weed, in the past was a highly praised plant, right? In the Netherlands, we have the dandelion. You know the dandelion, right?
Yeah.
In England you have it all. I'm not sure if it grows in Indonesia. I haven't seen it yet, but
Me neither.
no. But dandelions in Europe, now it's a weed, but it's called Taraxi. I always mess up the first name. Taraxicacum. Forget about the first name. Officinale is the species name. Officinale means of the apothecary.
Mm-hmm.
It's a medicinal plant.
Mm-hmm.
It was a highly praised medicinal plant. The first flora of the Netherlands says this is the primary plant in Dutch medicine.
Probably if we
now it's a weed.
Yeah.
Times change. Yeah.
Probably if we rid ourselves of our hostile attitude, or even if we are scared about something that is invasive, there lies probably the answer to our problems. Probably we need to open up ourselves towards something we don't know yet, just like we need to open ourselves towards invasive weed.
Yeah. I think in a certain sense, we forget a lot, right? So I think sometimes people forget the stories behind plants.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the story, if you don't know anything about something, you cannot protect it, right? And that sounds like a soundbite, but I really mean like, if you don't have some knowledge, I always find like if I know a story about a plant, I notice it far more. I'm far more interested in it than if I don't know. If you don't know the name, if you don't know a story about it, it's very hard to appreciate.
Yes.
So I think, narratives underlie appreciation, aesthetics, ethics, in that sense, I think.
Great note to end. It's a pleasure having you, Norbert. Good luck with your
thank you.
endeavor. Well, folks, that's Chronicles.